scientists held things they were never meant to understand. They didn't talk about the woods the way you and I might. They talked about them the way you talk about something alive, something patient, something that watches. These are some of the oldest mountains on Earth. They run along the eastern edge of North America, in long, worn ridges, soft and green and endless, and for as long as anyone has lived among them, strange things have happened here. Children have walked into open meadows and simply not walked back out. Animals have been found drained of their blood. Lights have risen over the ridgelines, night after night, with a patience no one has ever fully explained. Some of these stories can be traced to a real moment in time, with names and dates and official records. Others live only in the memory of families who passed them down by firelight, because there was no one else to tell. Today we're going to walk through several of them, slowly, and we're going to sit with the parts that still have no answer. But we begin with a single afternoon in June of 1969, and with a small boy in a bright red shirt, a quiet afternoon. Dennis Martin was 5 days away from his 7th birthday. He had come up into the Great Smoky Mountains with his family for his very first overnight camping trip. It was Father's Day weekend. His father, William, was there, along with his 9-year-old brother, Douglas, and his grandfather, Clyde. 3 generations of the Martin family, all together in the high country. They had walked in from Cades Cove the day before, about 10 miles of trail, and camped overnight at a place called Russell Field. The next morning they climbed the rest of the way to a spot called Spencefield. Spencefield is a place that stops you when you first see it. Nearly 200 acres of open grass, sitting almost 5,000 feet up in the sky, right on the line where Tennessee meets North Carolina. After a long climb through dark forest, you come out into all that light and space, a wide green meadow ringed by thick walls of mountain laurel and rhododendron. When the Martins arrived, they found they weren't alone. Another family was already there, led by a man named Dr. Carter Martin, who had come up from Alabama. The shared last name was pure coincidence. The 2 families weren't related at all, but they were friendly, and the children drifted together the way children always do. It was about 4:30 in the afternoon when the kids came up with a game. The plan was simple, the kind of thing children dream up in a single minute. They would sneak away, circle around, and jump out to surprise the grown-ups. Douglas and the other children would come from one direction. Dennis would loop around the far side of the meadow and appear from the other. But there was a problem. Dennis was wearing a bright red shirt. That red would give him away long before he ever reached his hiding place. So the older children sent him off on his own, telling him to take the long way around, along the edge of the field, where the thick brush would swallow the color and keep him hidden until the moment was right. William Martin watched his son go. For a little while, that red shirt made Dennis easy to follow, a small bright shape moving through the mountain laurel at the meadow's edge. Then the boy slipped into the undergrowth, and the color disappeared into the green. The disappearance. 5 minutes passed. Douglas and the other children played their part perfectly. They burst out of the brush, shouting, and the adults did what adults always do. They pretended to be startled. They laughed. They scolded the children with smiles on their faces. It was a small, ordinary moment of happiness, Sunday afternoon, but Dennis never came out. William looked toward the spot where he'd last seen that flash of red vanish into the bushes. He called his son's name once, expecting a small voice to answer from somewhere beyond the laurel. The only reply was the quiet rustle of leaves moving in the wind. He called again, louder this time. Nothing, and a particular kind of worry began to settle over him, because Dennis wasn't the sort of child who wandered off and hid when he was called. He was an obedient boy, the kind who came the moment he heard his father's voice, and there was concern in his father's voice now. William started toward the trees. Clyde, the grandfather, went the other way. Both families spread out across the meadow, calling the boy's name into the open air. The sun drifted lower behind the peaks. Long shadows stretched across the grass, and the warm afternoon began to give way to the cool, thin air of 5,000 feet. By 6 o'clock, less than 2 hours after the game began, everyone in that meadow understood the same terrible thing. Something had gone very wrong, and what happened next only made it stranger. The search begins. You have to remember what year this was. This was 1969. There were no cell phones. There was no way to call for help from the top of a mountain. If you needed the authorities, you had to go and find them yourself, on foot. So Clyde Martin, the grandfather, turned and hiked 9 miles back down the mountain in the fading light to report his grandson missing, and behind him a storm was building. By the time Clyde reached the ranger station, the rain had started, and it came down hard. 2.5 inches fell in just 3 hours. That rain did something cruel. It washed away any trail a small boy might have left behind, any footprint, any broken branch, any thread of scent. The mountain erased its own evidence before the search had even truly begun. What followed became one of the largest search operations in the history of the National Park Service, and it still holds that place today. Over 1,400 volunteers eventually combed through 56 square miles of the Smokies. The search lasted 16 days. The FBI opened case files. Green Berets, some of them just back from Vietnam, joined the effort. And here's the sad irony. So many people poured into those mountains that the search began to work against itself. All those boots, all those hands moving through the brush, trampled and destroyed the very clues they were searching for. Day after day, they found nothing. But 7 miles away, on that first evening, one man had already heard something he would never forget. The strange witness. To understand why this story haunted everyone who lived through it, you have to travel about 7 miles to the southwest of that meadow, to a place near Sea Branch. There, at the same time the Martins were beginning to panic, a man named Harold Key was having a picnic with his family in the quiet of the evening. Sometime between 6 o'clock and 6:45, roughly 2 hours after Dennis vanished, Harold heard a sound. He tried to describe it for the rest of his life, and he never found the right words. He called it enormous, sickening, fundamentally wrong. It wasn't the cry of any animal he knew, and he had lived in these mountains for decades. It wasn't a human in distress. It was, he said, something else entirely. The sound made the whole family look up from their meal and turn toward the tree line, and within minutes they saw a figure. A man came out of the woods, moving fast through the undergrowth, but he didn't move like a hiker. He moved like someone being chased, or like someone chasing. He was filthy and unkempt, his hair hanging past his shoulders, his clothes torn. person who had been living rough in the wilderness for a very long time, and over his shoulder, the family said, he seemed to be carrying something. It looked like cloth, or clothing. The moment the stranger realized he was being watched, he changed direction. He turned sharply and plunged deeper into the forest, and then he was gone. Harold Key was careful about the time. He fixed it in his memory, somewhere between 6 and 6:45 in the evening on June the 14th, 1969. Now I sit with the timeline for a moment. Dennis Martin disappeared from Spencefield at 4:30 in the afternoon. Roughly 2 hours later, 7 miles away, Harold Key heard a scream unlike anything in his life and watched a wild-looking man carry what appeared to be clothing away into the trees. Could a 6-year-old boy have crossed 7 miles of rough mountain wilderness on his own in 2 hours? It seems impossible. And if he didn't walk there himself, then the only other answer is that something carried him. There is no proven connection between those two events. No one has ever shown that the man Harold saw had anything to do with Dennis. The witness account is real and documented. What it means is still unknown. And 3 days later, the mountain offered up one more clue, one that only deepened the mystery. The footprints. 3 days into the search, something turned up that should have changed everything. Searchers found a set of small footprints pressed into the mud near Eagle Creek, several miles from Spencefield. The prints told a strange little story on their own. One foot was bare, the other showed the clear pattern of a boy's Oxford shoe, size 2.5. That was exactly the size Dennis Martin had been wearing. The tracks led toward the water, and then they simply stopped. Park officials dismissed them almost at once. They said the prints must have belonged to a Boy Scout in the search party. They argued the spot was too far from where Dennis was last seen, and that the tracks looked like they were made by someone older than 6. But there were problems with that explanation, and they never went away. A retired park ranger named Dwight McCarter spent decades studying those footprints. He noticed that the tracks didn't fit the pattern of a group of searchers moving together. They led away from the search area, not toward it. And they showed purpose, direction, not the aimless wandering that you'd expect from a lost, frightened child. Then there was the detail no one could explain away. None of the children in the search party had been barefoot, so who left a single bare footprint beside the print of a size 2.5 shoe, walking with purpose toward the water, miles from where a barefoot child should have been? That question was never answered, and it was only the beginning of the questions this case would leave behind. The search ends. The official search went on for 2 more weeks, and then it ended in complete failure. Dennis Martin was never found. No trace of his clothing was ever discovered. No remains were ever recovered. A small boy in a bright red shirt walked into the brush at the edge of a mountain meadow at 4:30 on a June afternoon in 1969. And to this day, that is the last certain thing anyone can say about him. His disappearance could have become just another unsolved missing person case, a tragedy, quietly closed. Instead, it became part of something much older, a pattern that stretches across these mountains, going back further than anyone can say. Something different about these mountains. People who study these things have noticed a question that keeps returning. Why here? Why do so many people seem to vanish in these particular mountain parks, more often than in wilderness areas many times their size? Over the years, a researcher named David Paulides has collected disappearances that he groups under a single name, cases he calls Missing 411, and he argues that many of them share the same unsettling shape. People vanish from places where vanishing should be nearly impossible. Search dogs lose the scent at specific points on the map, sometimes the very same points, over and over. Experienced hikers turn up in locations that seem physically impossible to reach in the condition they were found in. It's important to be honest here. This is a framework proposed by one researcher, and it's disputed. It's a lens, not a proven law of nature, but once you know the shape it describes, the Martin case fits it almost perfectly. And that is part of why it refuses to feed. So people reach for explanations, and some of those explanations are very old. There's an idea, far older than any of these cases, called the thin place. A thin place is somewhere the ordinary rules of the world feel closer to the surface. Somewhere the boundary between what we know and what lies beyond it seems worn down. The idea has been attached to Stonehenge, to the Egyptian pyramids, to sites all over the world. At heart, it's simply a way for people to name a place that produces experiences they can't fit into their picture of reality. And by that definition, many people have long thought of these mountains as one enormous thin place. Then there's the geology, which is genuinely remarkable. These mountains are around 480 million years old. They were built and rebuilt through 4 separate mountain building events, with names like the Grenville and the Taconic, the Acadian and the Alleghanian. All that ancient upheaval left behind a landscape with an unusual electromagnetic character, and that is where a theory begins to take shape. I want to walk through this carefully, because it matters that we keep it labeled for what it is. This is a theory. Parts of it rest on real science, but none of it has ever been proven to explain a single disappearance. There was a researcher named Dr. Michael Persinger at Laurentian University who spent years studying how weak magnetic fields affect the human brain. He built a device sometimes called the God Helmet. It generated magnetic fields only slightly stronger than those of a hair dryer. In his experiments, he reported that a large majority of his subjects, around 80%, described unusual experiences while wearing it. They spoke of sensing a presence in the room, of losing track of time, of feeling as though they had left their own bodies. That much is his documented research. The next step is where the storytellers take over, and it's speculation rather than fact. The suggestion is that the natural conditions of these mountains might, in certain places, resemble the kind of stimulation Persinger created in his lab. There is a real feature called the Brunswick Magnetic Anomaly, running from South Carolina up into Pennsylvania. Within it, according to these accounts, there are spots where compasses spin and electronics fail without a clear cause. The source material also points to research suggesting that the Earth's crust is unusually thin beneath parts of this region, though that particular claim is harder to pin down and should be taken with real caution. The mountains are rich in quartz, and when quartz is squeezed by shifting rock, it can produce small electrical fields, a genuine phenomenon called piezoelectricity. Stack all of it together and you arrive at the theory in its fullest form. The idea that these mountains might act in certain hidden pockets like a vast, natural version of Persinger's experimental chamber, quietly bending the perceptions of anyone who wanders into them. And I want to be honest with you. That's a long chain of speculation. Each single piece may be real, but the conclusion that ties them to actual disappearances has never been demonstrated. It's a story people tell to make sense of a landscape that has frightened them for a very long time. Whether there's anything to it at all, no one knows. But there's a second answer to the question of why here, and it doesn't require anything super locals make legends. Imagine you're an early settler, arriving in these mountains generations ago from somewhere far away, from the low, damp green of Scotland, perhaps, or from Germany, or from the coast of West Africa, by way of a much darker journey. You come up into this high, folded country, and things happen here that your old picture of the world simply cannot hold. A child vanishes from an open field and is never seen again. A hunter comes home shaken, describing something in the trees that shouldn't exist, and you have no one to call. There's no expert to consult, no authority to file a report with. There is only your family and your neighbors and the long dark of the winter nights. So you do what human beings have always done. You build a story that can hold the experience. You give the thing in the woods a name and a shape. You attach a warning to it so that the next person will know to be careful. That is where so much of this folklore comes from. It isn't simply entertainment, it's a survival guide, wrapped in a form that can be remembered and passed down through generations. 3 things made these mountains especially good at producing that kind of story. The first was isolation. Families in remote hollows had no one to turn to but each other for the meaning of frightening events. So they became self-reliant, even in their explanations. The second was the spoken word. For a very long time, few people here read or wrote. Stories carried the full weight of a community's knowledge, and they were polished through countless retellings until they hardened into legend. Think about how that works. Each teller adds a small detail, draws a new connection, and over the years, an ordinary, frightening event can grow into something enormous. Picture a large, strong man who once killed someone in a fight. Now imagine that story told and retold for centuries, until the man becomes a towering, airy creature stalking the trees. The seed can be small, the legend can be vast. The third thing was the mixing of many different peoples. These mountains were settled by groups from very different worlds, and each brought its own way of explaining the unexplainable. More than a dozen Native American peoples had ties to this land, among them the Cherokee and the Shawnee, and their traditions already held knowledge of dangerous places. Celtic settlers brought the idea of second sight, a perception of things others could not see. German settlers brought folk practices for supernatural encounters. West African traditions added yet another layer. By the late 19th century, nearly every hollow had its own catalogue of creatures, its own list of places to avoid, its own quiet roster of families said to carry strange gifts. All of that, held together in isolation and carried by voice for generations, is why these mountains became something like a factory for folklore. So let's look at a few of the legends they produced, and in each one, let's try to see where the facts end and the story begins. We start with a town where, one cold January, the animals began to die. The Beast of Bladenboro. In January of 1954, in a small North Carolina town called Bladenboro, something came out of the pine forest. Bladenboro was a quiet place, home to about 800 people, the kind of town where the news usually meant the price of tobacco or the fortunes of the high school basketball team. But for 13 days that winter, it became a place gripped by fear. The local police chief was a man named Roy Forrest, and he had seen his share of animal attacks over the years. But when he examined the dead dogs found around town at the end of 1953, he knew this was different. There were no defensive wounds, no scattered fur to hint at a struggle. The animals looked, as he put it, emptied. An autopsy seemed to confirm the impossible detail that would come to define the whole affair. animals had been drained of nearly all their blood, with only 2 or 3 drops left inside them. And the wounds were strange in another way. They were nearly identical from one animal to the next, carried out with a kind of grim precision. Jawbone smashed, lower lip split. Whatever was doing this was methodical. The trouble had begun a few days earlier, on December the 29th, in the nearby town of Clarkton. A woman reported seeing a large cat-like creature slipping away into the dark. By the next morning, her neighbor's dogs were gone. On New Year's Day, a man named Johnny Voss described what happened at his own home. His dogs, he said, put up a good fight. There was blood across the porch in wide puddles, and a pool of saliva beside it. Something killed one dog and left it lying there. His father wrapped the body in a blanket, and later that same creature came back and took it. In the early hours of the morning, it returned once more, killed the second dog, and carried it off. When those dogs were finally found, one had the top of its head torn away, its body crushed and wet, as though it had been held in something's mouth. The other had lost its lower jaw entirely. On January the 3rd, Chief Forres brought in trained hands to track the killer. These were dogs bred for courage, meant to pursue almost anything. But when they caught the scent of whatever had done this, they recoiled. They refused the trail and backed away, whimpering. That same day, another autopsy confirmed the chief's worst fear. The animals weren't being eaten. They were being drained. The reports kept coming. On January the 5th, a family's pet rabbit was found cleanly decapitated and still warm. That same day, a man named Dieter Shaw came upon a goat, with its skull crushed completely flat. Decades later, he still described it the same way, saying the head was flat as a fritter. He would spread 4 fingers across his palm to show the size of the paw prints he'd seen, as large as silver dollars. Then, on January the 6th, the story crossed the line. A 21-year-old mother named Mrs. C.E. Kinlaw stepped onto her front porch at 7:30 in the evening to hang laundry. About 20 feet away, in the gathering dark, something was waiting. She looked up to see a large, cat-like creature moving towards her, slow and deliberate, its eyes catching the porch light as it seemed to measure her. She screamed and ran inside. Her husband, Charles, grabbed a shotgun and rushed out, but he found only paw prints scattered across the yard, each one larger than a silver dollar. For the first time, the thing that had been killing animals seemed to have turned toward a person. After that, fear took the whole town. Women locked their doors at sundown. Men who had never owned a gun in their lives went out and bought shotguns and pistols. Families who had always used outdoor privies began keeping chamber pots inside so they wouldn't have to step out into the dark. And there was the sound. Witnesses kept describing the same unearthly cry. Something like a baby crying, or a woman screaming. A professional hunter named S.W. Garrett heard it while he was out tracking, and he compared it to the scream of a panther, but he admitted he had never heard anything quite like it. The descriptions of the creature never fully agreed. Some said it was around 4.5 feet long and bushy, resembling either a bear or a panther. Weight guesses ran wildly, from 80 pounds to 150 and beyond, some of them based only on how heavily the thing crashed through the underbrush. The tracks showed claws at least an inch long. Some called it brownish and tabby, others dark, with a cat-like face. But on one point, every witness agreed. It moved with an unsettling succeeded. The town's mayor, Woodrow Fussell, owned the local movie theater, and he had a showman's instincts. As the hunters poured in, he booked a film to screen on January the 9th. It was called The Big Cats. His advertisements promised that nigh, at last, people could see the cat up on the screen in color. On the very same day the film played, he called off the hunt. There were too many guns in the woods, too much desperation, too great a chance that some overexcited hunter would shoot another man by mistake. A newspaper captured the moment with a headline that has outlived almost everything else about the case. Vampire Beast wins Battle of Bladenboro. On January the 13th, a man named Luther Davis found a bobcat caught in a steel trap about 4 miles from town. He shot it, dragged it into the town square, and Mayor Fussell hung it from a flagpole with a sign that read, "This is the Beast of Bladenboro." The killing stopped. The hunters went home. The newspapers moved on. But it's fair to wonder whether that bobcat was really the answer. A bobcat weighs around 20 pounds. Could an animal that size kill a 90-pound dog and drain it of blood? Could it crush a goat skull flat and smash jaws with such precision? And why did the tracking hounds, bred to fear almost nothing, refuse the trail? Those questions were never truly resolved. Years later, Mayor Fussell offered a telling remark, saying that a little publicity never hurt a small town. He guessed the beast had been perhaps 10% real and 90% imagination. And yet it was Fussell himself who first called the newspapers about these dead dogs, which suggests that even he found their manner of death strange enough to want the world to see it. Today, Bladenboro holds an annual festival in the creature's honor. The thing that once terrorized the town has become the town's mascot, but not every legend in these mountains is a beast. Some are far quieter and far older. The Moon-Eyed People. Some of the oldest stories here are also the gentlest, at least at first. Among the Cherokee, there were traditions about a race of little people, and one of the most important things about them was a rule. You were not supposed to watch. According to the tradition, Cherokee families would sometimes wake at dawn to find their cornfields cleared and tended. The stalks gathered into neat bundles, the rows weeded with careful precision, as though an entire workforce had labored there through the night. But the help came with a price, and the price was silence. A Cherokee author named Lynn Losia, who wrote about these little people, described how they might come near a house in the dark. The people inside would hear them talking, but they must not go out to look. Those who broke the rule paid for it. Hunters who glimpsed the little people at their work were said to have stones thrown at them as they walked home. Families who spied on their nighttime visitors found the kindness withdrawn for good, their fields left untended afterward, their corn withering in ground that had once seemed blessed. Tradition held that when a person found any object in the woods that might belong to these hidden dwellers, a knife, a trinket, anything at all, they were to say aloud that they wished to take it, and to take nothing without asking first. European settlers gave this idea a different name, one that fixed on a single feature. They called them the Moon-Eyed People, because the story said their eyes worked better in darkness than in daylight. Here, the history grows tangled, and it's worth being honest about how much of it comes secondhand. In 1797, a botanist named Benjamin Smith Barton published what's considered the first written account. He drew on information from a Colonel Leonard Marbury, who had served as a go-between for the Cherokee and the United States government. Barton wrote that first arrived in the country they now inhabited, they found it already occupied by moon-eyed people who could not see in the daytime, and that the Cherokee drove those people out. That single account raises a difficult question. Are the helpful little people who tended the corn the same as the earlier population said to have been driven out? The stories seem to describe two different groups that happen to share certain traits. Small stature, a preference for night, eyes made for the dark. It's not clear they were ever meant to be the same thing at all. Then there are the objects people have tried to connect to the legend. In the 1840s, a farmer named Felix Ashley is said to have found a soapstone statue about 3 feet tall, some 60 miles from the Georgia mountains. It showed two entwined figures with oval heads and large crescent-shaped eyes. People noted how closely it matched the descriptions of the moon-eyed people. That statue sits today in the Cherokee County Historical Museum in Murphy, North Carolina. In 1882, a Cherokee newspaper called the Cherokee Phoenix described the excavation of 3 burying grounds near Sparta, Tennessee. They were said to contain the skeletons of unusually small people, the longest of them measuring only 19 inches. Several were reported to have adult teeth, worn down with age, which would suggest they had lived full lives despite their size. They had been buried in stone coffins, alongside items possibly made from shells. What became of those remains, no record says. And then, there is Fort Mountain in northern Georgia, which carries the most substantial trace of all. There, an ancient stone wall runs for 885 feet in a zigzagging line along the mountain. Archaeologists estimate it was built somewhere between roughly 500 and 1500 years ago. What's strange is that the wall doesn't seem built for defense. It's too low to protect anyone. There's no water source it could have guarded. Its position makes a little military sense. That has led many to suspect it served some ceremonial purpose instead, which only deepens the question of who built it and why. A park manager there, Emmanuel Stewart, has said, "The moon-eyed people are one of the main reasons visitors come. Day after day, they ask about the legend." A historical marker at the site credits the moon-eyed people with the wall's construction, though Stewart has noted that archaeological work has turned up very few real clues about who actually raised it. There is one more thing that has to be said plainly. The earliest written accounts of the moon-eyed people don't come from Cherokee sources. They come from white settlers, eager to explain the ancient ruins they found in terms they could understand. Some reached for wild theories, suggesting the moon-eyed people were descendants of a legendary Welsh prince, or albino communities, or Welsh miners whose work underground had given them pale skin and a reputation for the night. From much of the research, it seems this was never a central part of Cherokee history, so much as an outsider's attempt to explain an encounter they couldn't otherwise place. Who the little people truly were, if they were anyone at all, remains unknown. Not every haunting in these mountains is so quiet, though. The most famous ghost story in all of America was born in these hills. And it began with a family being tormented, night after night, by something that seemed to want a man dead. The Bell Witch. It began in 1817 in Robertson County, Tennessee, on the farm of a man named John Bell. That October, Bell was hunting on his own land when his dogs, animals that had tracked wildcats through the Cumberland woods without fear, suddenly cowered behind him. In his cornfield sat something that looked like a dog, with the oversized head of a rabbit. It watched him with what he described as intelligent eyes. He raised his rifle and fired. The creature vanished. By December, the sound started. Every night, after the family went to bed, something moved through the walls of the farmhouse. invisible rats chewing through wood that showed no damage by morning. The noises followed a deliberate rhythm, starting soft, then building, until they seemed to shake the whole house. In January of 1818, it turned physical. The Bell's 12-year-old daughter, Betsy, woke screaming with red welts across her face, as though an invisible hand had struck her hard enough to leave a mark. The attacks grew worse. Her hair was pulled until she shrieked. Pins were driven into her skin. Her bed covers were torn away in the freezing winter nights. But the entity saved its worst for John Bell himself. He began to suffer a strange paralysis of the face. His tongue swelled until he couldn't speak. During meals, his throat would tighten without warning, leaving him struggling to breathe. Several physicians examined him and could offer no explanation, though it should be said this was 1818, and medicine could do very little. By the spring of that year, the thing found a voice. At first it was faint, described as the weak whisper of an old woman. It announced that it was a spirit, saying it had once been happy but had been disturbed. Over time, the voice grew stronger, strong enough to recite scripture and argue theology with visiting ministers. It seemed to hold impossible knowledge. On one occasion, it was said to have repeated, word for word, 2 different sermons being delivered at the very same moment, 13 miles apart. It knew private details about the neighbors. It spoke in different accents. Eventually, it gave itself a name. It called itself Kate and claimed to be the spirit of a woman named Kate Batts, a neighbor John Bell had quarreled with over a land deal. There was only one problem with that claim. Kate Batts was still very much alive, and she would go on to outlive John Bell by 27 years. Word spread through Middle Tennessee, and hundreds of visitors came to the Bell farm. Curious onlookers, ministers, physicians, all wanting to witness what one newspaper reportedly called the wonder of the century. The entity seemed to enjoy the crowds. It was said to pull fresh fruit out of the air, to sing songs during prayer meetings, to share gossip, and sometimes to leave a conversation entirely, to go and investigate events miles away before returning with a full report. A respected church elder and close friend of the family, James Johnston, stayed overnight to investigate. He had his own covers ripped away and his face slapped. When he demanded, in the name of the Lord, to know who it was and what it wanted, the answer was silence, and the rest of that night passed in peace. But beneath the spectacle there was cruelty with a purpose. The entity showed real kindness only to Betsy's mother, Lucy Bell, whom it called the most perfect woman ever to walk the earth. Toward Betsy, it waged a relentless campaign, one clearly aimed at destroying her engagement to a young neighbor named Joshua Gardner. In the end, that campaign succeeded, and for John Bell, the entity reserved a promise. It declared that it had come to kill him, using a private nickname known only to his closest friends. As the months passed, Bell's condition worsened. His paralysis deepened, his speech slurred. Mysterious seizures left him bedridden for days at a time. On December the 20th, 1820, his son found him unconscious, and nearby, in a cupboard where no medicine had ever been kept, sat a small vial of dark liquid. They tested a single drop of it on the family cat. The animal died within seconds. The entity's voice was said to fill the house with laughter, boasting that it had given the old man a heavy dose the night before, while he slept. John Bell died that afternoon. And songs and laugh. According to the legend, Tennessee became the only state to officially recognize a death caused by supernatural forces, though that claim belongs to the folklore, not to any verifiable record. And this is where honesty forces us to step back, because there's a serious problem with the whole story. Nearly every detail we have comes from a single source. A book published in 1894 by a man named Martin Van Buren Ingram titled An Authenticated History of the Famous Bellwit. Ingram claimed his account rested on the diary of Richard William Bell, one of John Bell's sons, but Richard was only 6 years old when the haunting began, which makes a detailed diary from him nearly impossible, and no one has ever seen this diary. Modern researchers suspect it never existed at all. Ingram's credibility has other cracks. He claimed a major magazine had published and then retracted an article about the case in 1849, an article that extensive searching has never found. His account contains details and turns of phrase that don't fit the period he was writing about. And most damning of all, every single person with direct knowledge of the events was already dead by the time he began his research in the 1890s. There was no one left to contradict him, and yet the legend wasn't invented out of nothing. There's an 1820 journal entry from a military officer named John R. Bell, describing rumors of a young woman accompanied by a mysterious voice, an attraction thousands were said to have visited. There are articles from the 1850s that retell parts of the story, decades before Ingram added his embellishments. So something real lay underneath. It may have been poltergeist-type activity centered on a troubled young girl. It may have been deliberate manipulation by someone skilled in illusion. It may have been nothing more than frontier fear feeding on itself. And there's one detail that has always invited suspicion. In 1824, a few years after her engagement was destroyed, Betsy Bell married her former schoolteacher, a man named Richard Powell. He was 11 years her senior, and he had shown interest in her during the haunting. Powell was reportedly skilled in mesmerism and ventriloquism, and regarded as unusually intelligent for his time and place. Some have suggested he orchestrated the whole thing to clear his path to her. There is no proof of that either. Like everything else in the story, it remains a possibility with no way to confirm it. We end with the strangest of them all, and perhaps the one most purely of these mountains, because it isn't a beast, or a ghost, or a lost race of people. It's simply light, the Brown Mountain Lights. For more than a century, lights have appeared over Brown Mountain in North Carolina, and no one has ever fully explained them. Science has answered a great deal of this mystery. It has just never answered all of it. The lights were first officially reported around 1910, and in those early accounts they came with almost clockwork regularity. Every night, around 7:30, and then again around 10 o'clock, red lights would rise above the crest of the mountain, like a silent firework. They would hover for less than a minute, and then wink out. But the story likely reaches back much further. According to family tradition, a man named Josiah Fate Wiseman first noticed a strange flash of light around 1854 while camping at a spot now called Wiseman's View. The light appeared at the same place on the horizon at nearly the same time, every single night, never varying by more than half an hour, and he returned again and again, staring into the distance, waiting for it. That date matters. The year 1854 comes before so much of what people would later use to explain the lights, before electric lighting was common, before first train in western North Carolina began running at night between Morganton and Salisbury in 1858, and trains do follow fixed schedules, the way fate's light seemed to. But that can't account for a light seen 4 years before the train arrived, and it can't account for everything that came later. By 1913, the lights had drawn serious attention. A newspaper, the Charlotte Daily Observer, described mysterious lights seen just above the horizon every night, red in color, appearing punctually at set times. One old and reliable resident, Anderson Loven, was said to have been watching them since 1897. That same year, the United States Geological Survey sent an investigator named D.B. Starrett to look into it. His conclusion was quick and dismissive. "Headlights," he said. Nothing more. The case was closed. Except it wasn't. In 1916, a great flood struck the region, and train service around Brown Mountain stopped for several weeks. The lights kept appearing anyway. In 1922, the government tried again. This time, it sent a geologist named George Rogers Mansfield to carry out the most thorough investigation the lights had ever received. Mansfield came with real equipment: telescopes, cameras, mapping tools. He set up 3 observation stations and spent weeks plotting every light he saw with careful precision. Night after night, he traced them to ordinary sources: train headlights, automobile headlights on distant mountain roads, brush fires. He explained that the Catawba Valley, east of the town of Marion, forms a pocket of cool air that can bend and scatter light from far-off sources, making distant, mundane lights look strange and close, and impossible to place. His final accounting read almost like a ledger. 47% of the lights, he concluded, were automobile headlights. 33% were locomotive headlights. 10% were stationary electric lights. And the last 10% were brush fires. For many people, that settled it. But the lights refused to stay settled. Over the decades that followed, the legend only grew. In 1965, a man named Rolf Lyell, who displayed what he claimed was a mummified alien in his rock shop, published a book describing his own encounters on Brown Mountain, claiming that beings had carried him away to another world. That is folklore layered onto folklore, and it's worth treating as exactly that. But alongside the tall tales, careful modern work has continued. Researchers at Appalachian State University installed low-light cameras on rooftops overlooking Brown Mountain and nearby Linville Gorge. By 2014, they had recorded some 6,300 hours of footage, and they were able to trace nearly every single sighting to an identifiable source: cars, aircraft, atmospheric effects, even planets hanging low on the horizon. Nearly every single one, but not all of them. A handful of photographs remain unexplained. Some witness accounts still don't fit the headlight theory, describing lights that move in ways distant vehicles cannot. Lights that appear in weather that should prevent the bending of light, Mansfield described. Lights that some observers even felt were responding to them. So while patient science has dissolved most of the mystery, a small, stubborn residue of it remains, glowing on the ridgeline, refusing to be named the unanswered mystery. These are only a handful of the stories these mountains hold. There are many more in every hollow and along every ridge, and most of them will never be written down at all. But taken together, they point at something worth sitting with, now that we've come to the end. Some of what we've walked through tonight dissolves under a close look. The Bell Witch traces back to a single unreliable author. mountain lights turn out to be, in the overwhelming majority of cases, headlights and brush fires bent by a valley of cool air, and that should be a comfort in a way. It shows that patience and careful attention really can peel back the strange and find something ordinary underneath. And yet, in nearly every one of these stories, something small is left behind that the explanations don't quite cover. A bare footprint beside a size 2.5 shoe, walking with purpose toward the water, miles from where a lost child should have been. Tracking hinds that refused a trail they were bred to follow. A wild man carrying what looked like clothing out of the woods. On the same evening, a boy in a red shirt vanished. A few photographs of a light that no camera has ever managed to explain. These leftovers are what keep the stories alive. They are the small open doors that even patient science has never quite managed to close. Maybe the truest thing about these mountains isn't any single beast, or ghost, or vanishing. Maybe it's the way the land itself refuses to be fully known. It's one of the oldest places on Earth, folded and refolded across nearly 500 million years, thick with brush and quartz and cold high meadows, where a child can walk into the tree line in the middle of a family game and simply never walk back out. People have always needed to explain that, and so the mountains have always given us stories, generation after generation, each one an attempt to hold something the mind can't quite grasp. Dennis Martin was 5 days from his 7th birthday. He is still officially missing. No clothing, no remains, no answer, more than half a century later, and somewhere up in that high country, in a meadow ringed with mountain laurel, the last certain trace of him is a flash of red, disappearing into the green on a warm June afternoon at 4:30. The mountains have kept that secret, the way they've kept so many others.